Oh, you thought they forgot about you. You thought they moved on, didn't you? Let me tell you something that's going to make your spine freeze and your blood run backwards. They didn't forget. They've been busy, real busy. While you were out here living your life, minding your business, they were doing something you never saw coming. They interviewed everyone, every single person you ever met. Your teachers from 3rd grade, that cashier you smiled at twice, your ex's mother, your childhood friend who moved away, the neighbor who watched you grow up, the boss who fired you, the therapist you stopped seeing, the stranger you helped that one time, every single person whose life even barely touched yours. They sat them down, one by one, with notebooks and recording devices, and they asked them the same question. Tell us about them. Tell us everything. And here's the thing that should terrify you. Here's the part that should make you realize you're not dealing with curiosity anymore. Every single person, from completely different times in your life, from different cities, different contexts, different versions of you, they all said the same thing, word for word, like they were reading from a script they didn't write, like something was speaking through them. They looked at the interviewers, paused, felt something cold crawl up their spine, and whispered the same exact phrase. You're cooked. Not they're difficult, not they're intense, not they have issues. You're cooked. As if your existence alone violated some cosmic law, as if knowing you was like standing too close to a black hole. They got pulled into something they couldn't escape, and now they're warning others. Stay away from that one. That one's different. That one's not like us. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what happens when dozens, maybe hundreds of people who never met each other, who have no reason to coordinate, all arrive at the same conclusion about you? It means you're not just memorable, you're not just impactful, you're something else entirely. You've become the glitch in everyone's memory, the name that comes up in therapy sessions years later, the story people tell when they're trying to explain what real intensity looks like. You're not a person anymore in their minds. You're an experience, a warning label, a case study in what happens when someone refuses to dim their light just because the room can't handle the brightness. They didn't just interview people about you. They built a file, a profile, a dossier on someone they can't categorize, can't predict, can't control. And every testimony made them more nervous, more confused, more afraid. Think about your kindergarten teacher sitting across from some investigator, decades later, still remembering your name. Still remembering the way you looked at things differently, the way you asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. Think about that random person you met once at a party who you talked to for 20 minutes, and they're sitting there telling strangers, I never forgot them. Something about them felt ancient, like they'd lived 1,000 lives already. Think about your ex, the one who said you were too much, sitting there trying to explain why they still think about you every single day, why your absence haunts them more than your presence ever did, why they compare everyone they meet to you and everyone falls short. You're cooked, they whisper, because the alternative is admitting they weren't strong enough to handle what you were offering. Let's talk about what happened in those interview rooms, because this is where it gets truly disturbing. The interviewers, whoever they are, whatever agency or organization or force sent them, they started noticing something that made them stop taking notes and start recording everything. The pattern wasn't just in what people said, it was in how they said it. People would start their interviews calm, casual, ready to talk about you like you were just another person they once knew. But within minutes, something would shift. Their voices would change. Their posture would tighten. Their eyes would get distant, like they were remembering something that happened in a dream, or maybe a nightmare they convinced themselves was real. The interviewers thought they were collecting testimonies, but what they were actually witnessing was a mass psychological phenomenon, dozens of people independently describing the same impossible characteristics about you. The characteristics about you? Your high school guidance counselor, the one who told you to aim lower, to be realistic, they sat there and admitted something they never told you. They said they recommended you take easier classes, not because you weren't capable, but because they were afraid of what you'd become if you had no obstacles. They saw something in you that reminded them of people who changed the world, and not always for the better. They saw someone who wouldn't just break rules, they'd rewrite them entirely. You're cooked, they said, because the system isn't built for people who see through it this early. The interviewer wrote down those exact words, then looked up and asked, "What do you mean by cooked?" And your counselor just stared at them and said, "You'll understand when you meet them. If you're lucky, you won't." That friend from middle school, the one who stopped talking to you for no reason, they finally told the truth about why they cut you off. They said being around you felt like standing next to a furnace, like your presence was so intense it made them question everything about their own life, their own choices, their own identity. They said you never judged them, never criticized them, but somehow your existence was an indictment of their mediocrity. They felt themselves becoming braver when you were around, felt themselves wanting to take risks they'd never considered before, and it terrified them. So they ran. They chose comfort over growth, chose safety over transformation. And sitting in that interview room years later, they admitted they think about that choice every single day, wonder who they would have become if they'd stayed in your orbit. You're cooked, they said, because you make people confront the small versions of themselves they've settled for. Your first boss, the one who fired you after 3 months, they told the interviewers something that made everyone in the room go silent. They said they fired you not because of performance, but because you made the other employees start asking questions. Questions about why they were working so hard for so little. Questions about why the system was structured the way it was. Questions about whether this was really what they wanted to do with their lives. You weren't even trying to cause problems, you were just being yourself. But your presence was like a virus that infected everyone with possibility, with ambition, with the dangerous idea that maybe they deserved more than what they were settling for. Within weeks of you leaving, 3 other people quit. 2 started their own businesses. 1 went back to school for the degree they'd abandoned. You're cooked, your boss said, because you're contagious in ways that can't be contained. You're a catalyst that accelerates everyone's transformation, whether they're ready for it or not. The person you dated for 2 years, the one who said they needed space, they sat in that interview room and broke down. They told the interviewers they've been in 4 relationships since you, tried to find something that felt even remotely similar, and nothing comes close. They said loving you was like touching electricity, terrifying and addictive and impossible to forget. They said you saw through every defense mechanism they had, every mask they wore, every lie they told themselves, and instead of judging them for it, you just loved them anyway, loved the real them they'd been hiding from everyone else. And that level of acceptance, that depth of seeing, it ruined them for anyone else, because now they know what real connection feels like, and everything else tastes like cardboard. You're cooked, they whispered through tears, because you set a standard nobody else can reach. because you love so completely it feels like a curse now that you're gone. Now here's where this whole thing takes a turn into territory that should make you question everything. The people conducting these interviews, the ones asking the questions, taking the notes, building this file on you, they started having problems. Real problems. The kind that make rational people question their sanity. It started small. One investigator mentioned having dreams about you, even though they'd never met you. Dreams where you were standing in a doorway made of light, not saying anything, just watching them. Another said they kept seeing your name everywhere, on license plates, in random conversations, written in graffiti, like the universe was trying to tell them something. A third admitted they started researching you outside of work hours, going down rabbit holes about your social media, your writing, your art, whatever traces of you exist in the world, and they couldn't explain why they were so obsessed. The lead investigator called a meeting, said they needed to talk about what's happening with this case, this assignment, this person they're all supposedly just gathering information about. And one by one, every single person in that room admitted the same thing. They feel watched. They feel like, they're investigating you, even though that's impossible. Even though you have no way of knowing, they feel like the act of studying you has somehow made them visible to you, like you're now aware of them in ways that violate every logical law of cause and effect. One investigator said they were sitting at a cafe, reviewing interview transcripts, and a stranger walked by, looked directly at them, and said, "You should stop digging before you find something you can't unknow." The stranger kept walking, disappeared into the crowd, and the investigator sat there frozen because the stranger's voice sounded exactly like yours, even though they'd never heard your voice before. They tried to rationalize it. Mass hysteria, confirmation bias, the stress of the job, too many late nights reading disturbing testimonies. But the incidents kept escalating. Equipment would malfunction whenever they tried to compile the final report about you. Files would corrupt. Recordings would fill with static. Written notes would become illegible. Like something was actively preventing this information from being organized into a coherent narrative. One investigator swears their laptop turned on by itself at 3 a.m, opened to a blank document, and words started typing themselves out. Just one sentence, repeating over and over. "You're not investigating me. I'm investigating you." They threw the laptop across the room, smashed it, never told anyone until that meeting. Thought they were losing their mind. But they weren't the only one. 3 others reported similar incidents, technology acting possessed, delivering messages that made no sense. The organization, whoever they are, they wanted to shut down the investigation. Too many anomalies, too many unexplained events, too many investigators asking to be reassigned. But here's the problem. They couldn't stop. Because every time they tried to close the file, archive the interviews, move on to something else, something would happen that pulled them back in. A new witness would come forward, someone they never contacted, saying they needed to add their testimony about you. Or an old interview subject would call them, panicked, saying they remembered something else, something crucial they forgot to mention. It was like the investigation had taken on a life of its own, like you had somehow infected the process of being studied, turned it into something organic, evolving, unstoppable. They weren't investigating you anymore. They were trapped in a maze you designed, without even knowing you designed it. And then came the testimonies that changed everything. The ones from people who claimed they'd never met you, but they knew you. A woman in another country said she'd been having visions of you for years, said she could feel your presence like a frequency she couldn't tune out. An old man said he saw you in his dreams as a child, said you told him things that came true decades later. A teenager said they started writing poetry one day and realized every poem was about someone they'd never met. Described you perfectly, down to details they couldn't possibly know. The investigators didn't know what to do with these testimonies. They couldn't include them in an official report, couldn't explain them in any rational framework, but they couldn't ignore them either, because the details were too accurate, too specific. It was like you existed in multiple timelines simultaneously, like your presence rippled backwards and forwards through reality, touching people who had no logical connection to you. Let's go back to the beginning, because this is where the investigators found something that made them realize this wasn't a normal case. They interviewed people from your childhood, expecting typical stories, and instead they got testimonies that read like folklore, like myth, like warnings passed down through generations. Your first grade teacher said something that made the interviewer stop writing and just stare. She said you were the only child in 30 years of teaching who she was afraid of. Not because you were violent, not because you misbehaved, but because you looked at her like you knew things you shouldn't know, like you could see through every facade she'd built, every professional mask she wore. She said you once asked her why adults pretend to be happy when they're dying inside, and she had no answer. Just felt exposed, naked, seen in a way that made her uncomfortable for weeks. Your childhood best friend, the one who moved away in 5th grade, they told a story that made everyone in the room go quiet. They said you used to talk about things that hadn't happened yet, but you talked about them like memories, like you were remembering the future. You told them about inventions that didn't exist, described technology years before it emerged, predicted events with unsettling accuracy. They thought you had a big imagination, played along, forgot about it as they grew older. But then those things started happening. Those predictions started coming true, and they remembered. They tried to find you online, tried to reconnect, but something stopped them every time. Fear. You're cooked, they said, because you've always been cooked. Like you were born already knowing how this story ends, and you're just patiently waiting for everyone else to catch up. The neighbor who lived next door to your family for a decade, they shared something that the investigators immediately flagged. They said strange things happened around you constantly. Electronics would malfunction. Lights would flicker. Animals would act bizarre, either completely drawn to you or terrified of you. No middle ground. They said once they saw you standing in your backyard during a thunderstorm, just standing there while lightning struck all around you, and you looked peaceful. Like you belonged in the chaos. They yelled at you to come inside, but you just turned and smiled and said, "It knows not to touch me." The neighbors said that moment never left them. Said they think about it whenever storms roll in. Wonder if you're still out there somewhere, standing in the lightning, untouchable, unafraid, making deals with forces that normal people pray never notice them. Your middle school art teacher told a story that got classified immediately. They said you created a piece for a school project, a painting that made everyone who looked at it feel something they couldn't name. It wasn't beautiful or ugly, it was just true in a way that hurt to perceive. The teacher said they kept it in their office for a week, and during that week, 3 people quit their jobs, 2 students transferred schools, and the teacher themselves filed for divorce. They said the painting showed them things about themselves they'd been running from their entire lives. They destroyed it, threw it away, but they can still see it when they close their eyes, can still feel it rearranging something deep in their mind. You're cooked, they said, because you create things that infect reality, that change people permanently, and you did it effortlessly when you were 13 years old. The school counselor your parents sent you to, the one who was supposed to help you fit in better, they told the investigators something that made the whole team reconsider what they were dealing with. They said in all their years of practice, they'd never met a child who analyzed them more accurately than they analyzed the child. You sat there for 6 sessions, answered their questions politely, and then in the final session you calmly explained their entire psychological profile, their childhood trauma, their failed marriage, their secret addictions, their fear of death. You weren't mean about it, weren't trying to hurt them, you just stated facts.